Shalom, my name is Caleb. I am the Director of Operations at TorahResource.com. TorahResource exists to provide biblically based education for disciples of Yeshua. This series is entitled What Really Happened in Egypt. This is the third installment, and if you haven't seen the first two installments, I would encourage you to go back and watch them. You can find them on our Facebook page, the Torah Resource Facebook page, or you can also find them on the Messiah Matters YouTube page, and this is being broadcast on both of those, and it's also being broadcast on Torah Resource Radio. And you can find Torah Resource Radio by going to TorahResource.com and hovering over radio, and just click radio, and we stream music and lectures and all sorts of stuff 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So I would encourage you to check out that free resource. In the first installment of this series, I looked at I kind of started in Exodus 4, and then I also looked at Exodus chapter 6 and chapter 7, and we started looking at the first plague, which is the plague of blood, the Nile turning to blood, and what that might have meant to the Egyptians. And then we also, in part 2, we looked at Exodus chapter 9, and chapter 8 rather, and we looked at the three plagues in that chapter, including my favorite plague, the plague of frogs. And so now we're going to dive into chapter 9, and we're only going to have time today to look at chapter 9. And then next week we will finish our series up by looking at the final plagues and the death of the firstborn, and finally the exodus out of Egypt and through the Red Sea. And so if you have any questions for me, then you can email them to me. And actually, let me pull up my email address here for everybody. You can email me. My email address is chegg@TorahResource.com. It's CHEGG at TorahResource.com. You can also put comments in the comments on Facebook and or on YouTube, and we will try to look at those and answer them next week. Once I'm completed with this entire series, what I plan to do is make my notes available in one article format so that you can have all the notes in one article. And I will make that available, and then I will put a link somewhere on Torah Resource Facebook page so people can access that, and then you will also be able to find it in our free articles section on Torah Resource. And you can access that by going to TorahResource.com and hovering over library, and then go down to articles. And we have over 100 articles that are all free, and for you to download, print out, and utilize how you see fit. Okay, so without further ado, let's get into Exodus chapter 9. Coming from chapter 8, we have seen the Lord did not give warning to Pharaoh, but struck the land with flies. We saw that this plague may have been directed towards the priests/magicians of Egypt, the ones that were replicating the first several plagues. Now that the priests have lost control and have lost favor with the gods in the sight of the Egyptians, the Lord directs Moses to approach Pharaoh again. Warning is given in verse 1 that the next plague is coming. Now that the priests have been silenced, it is time to hit Egypt hard. Moses informs Pharaoh that if God's people are not let go, dever will come against the animals. This Hebrew word is used 46 times within the entire Tanakh. Of these 46 times, only 2 may refer to animals, once in our text and then once in Psalm 78:50. Within this psalm, the story of the Exodus is retold, and the 5th plague of pestilence is associated with the 10th plague, making the suggestion by the Net Bible that this verse is referring to cattle debatable. Yet, the translation of pestilence for the cattle plague is arguably the best translation. It leaves some question as to the specific nature of this disease. Much debate has been had over what extent this plague had on the Egyptian livestock, and I think that a lot of people just assume that it was directed at food, or I'm sure that there's a lot of assumptions that come up, and I'm not trying to be dogmatic one way or the other. I think there are some really good suggestions about why this plague was directed at cattle. Verse 6 informs us that all the livestock of Egypt died, but subsequent plagues involved livestock. If the time frame is longer than we might assume, and we have talked about this in some of the earlier installments, that the plagues might have actually been spread out over the course of a year instead of all happening within a couple weeks' time, as I think maybe it's natural to think of, especially with some of the Hollywood movies that have been out. We see all these things kind of happen right in a row as opposed to over the course of a year. So it is possible, and there's reasons to actually believe that this may have happened over the course of a year as opposed to in a very short, maybe month window. If the time frame is longer than we might assume, the Egyptians could have taken livestock from the Israelites, who were not affected, and we know that from verse 4 and 7, or perhaps bought new livestock from a neighboring country. And there's actually evidence that Egypt did this from time to time. And not necessarily evidence in this specific case, but that Egypt did purchase cattle from neighboring countries. Although this is a possibility, the truth may lie in verse 3 with the phrase asher basadeh, in the field. Kyle and Delitzsch note, in the words, all the cattle of the Egyptians died, all is not to be taken in an absolute sense, but according to popular usage, as denoting such a quantity that what remained was nothing in comparison. And according to verse 3, it must be entirely restricted to the cattle in the field. For according to verse 9 and 19, much of the cattle of the Egyptians still remained even after this murrain, though it extended to all kinds of cattle, horses, asses, camels, oxen, and sheep, and differed in this respect from natural murrains. The attack upon cattle has extensive implications for the Egyptians, so much so that it is difficult to pinpoint exactly where the plague was aimed. Most notably, the cow or the bull had been deified in various instances. Hathor worship was centered in the city of Dendera, and I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. I don't speak Egyptian, so you're going to have to forgive my pronunciation. Although Davis notes that that her popularity is witnessed by representations in both Upper and Lower Egypt. In an article for Ancient History Encyclopedia, Joshua Mark notes, Hathor is an ancient Egyptian goddess associated later with Isis and earlier with Sekhmet, but eventually was considered the primeval goddess from whom all others were derived. She is usually depicted as a woman with the head of a cow, ears of a cow, or simply in cow form. I'm sure there's a joke there somewhere. Davis states that quote, this goddess is often depicted as a cow suckling the king, giving him divine nourishment, meaning, that's an end quote, meaning the plague of pestilence on the cattle could be seen as an attack on Pharaoh's source of divine power. And this would be certainly fitting at this point, right? We've seen the Nile, which is deified and now bleeding profusely, and then we see frogs, and then the priests are kind of taken out of the equation, and now Pharaoh's divine power is taken out. It's actually a wonderful picture. If this is in fact what was going on. Quote, several religious cults in Egypt, that of Apis being the most prominent, worship the bull and calf. Deification of a live sacred bull was initiated during the first Egyptian dynasty and continued throughout ancient Egypt's long history. Bull cults of the Nile Delta, which existed at the same time and location as the Israelites' sojourn in Egypt, were dedicated to Horus, the god of heaven, end quote. This plague could have also been seen as a direct attack on Ra himself. Now, remember that Ra was like the top god in the Egyptian pantheon, and that he was seen, according to the Egyptians, he was seen in human form in Pharaoh. And so Pharaoh was the human or bodily representation of the god Ra. As the god Menevis was associated with Ra in the Middle Kingdom, which was circa 1938 to 1630 BCE, and was depicted at Heliopolis as a bull. Perhaps the most noteworthy among the Egyptian deities is that of the Apis bull. Worship of the Apis is recorded as early as the First Dynasty, and the First Dynasty was circa 3150 to about 2890 BCE, and was seen as the god Ptah incarnate. Ptah, and that's spelled P-T-A-H. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly. Ptah was originally the local deity of Memphis, the capital city of Egypt from the First Dynasty on. He was called the chief controller craftsman and was understood to be the patron craftsman and a divine blacksmith. There was only one Apis bull that was seen as deity at any given time. Once the Apis bull died, a new one was selected and needed to have 28 specific marks that needed to be seen for the bull to be chosen as the next deity. Some have suggested that the golden calf was an attempt to create a replica of the Apis god, but this view has been challenged, and I believe strongly challenged. Although long, Davis tells an intriguing story that is worth quoting in full. On November 13th, 1856, Augustine Marriott worked in this Memphis region, digging down to a shaft-like stairway to an underground avenue measuring 320 feet long. Later excavation indicated that the total length of the tunnel avenues reached 1,120 feet. Using only torchlight, Marriott and a few of his workmen discovered 64 large burial chambers arranged along an avenue. Near the center of each burial room was a huge red and black granite sarcophagus, approximately 12 feet long, 9 feet high, and 6 feet wide, each weighing about 60 tons. In each of these sacred Apis bulls had been buried. When Marriott moved through this area, it became apparent that the tombs had long ago been robbed, except for one chamber which had escaped the hands of treasure hunters. The one chamber had been sealed during the reign of Ramses II. G. Frederick Owen describes this discovery as follows. There, in the mortar, was the imprint of the fingers of the mason who had set the last stone during the reign of Ramses II, and there in the dust were the footprints of those who had trod the floor more than 3,000 years ago. There also were the votive offerings dedicated by visitors who had come and gone so many centuries ago. Among them, an inscribed tablet of Ramses' own son, high priest of Apis, and one of the chief dignitaries of the time. It is little wonder that when the great explorer stood in this tomb and saw things as they had remained inviolate for some 31 eventual centuries, he was overwhelmed and burst into tears. The sacred Apis bull kept in the enclosure near the temple of Ptah was fed on delicacies and given as many heifers as he wanted. Special bullfights were held in his honor. So the Apis bull was certainly a big deal back in that time. Okay. God commands Moses to initiate another plague. This time, like the third plague, it came without warning to Pharaoh. Moses is to throw piach into the air. This Hebrew word is only found twice in the entire Tanakh, both of which are in our passage, verses 8 and 10. The Net Bible suggests this word comes from the verb puach, meaning to breathe or to blow, and could represent the stoking of a furnace or a kiln. Although subtle, this brings special significance as the kilns were used to make bricks and were symbolic of the hardship Israel was enduring because of the work put on them by Pharaoh and the Egyptians. Once again, we see the humor of God coming through. The Israelites, God's slave people, the slave nation that God is going to redeem, is being oppressed by Pharaoh and the Egyptians. And how are they oppressing them? They're making them make their own bricks, and there's hardship in the labors that they're doing. And now this plague comes from the kiln itself, right? He takes the soot, he throws it up, and this is how the plague is initiated. This plague could be a direct attack on the Egyptian goddess Sekhmet. She was the goddess of sickness and healing and was also the destroyer of Ra's enemies. Once again, we see Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh's humor seeping through our narrative as the goddess of Egypt that is supposed to be in control of health and is the protector of Ra, physically represented in Pharaoh, has zero power against the living God. Sekhmet's so-called power has been entirely turned against Egypt. There are other Egyptian gods that the people of Egypt may have turned to for help. Serapis was a god of the underworld, but also a god of fertility and healing. But he was associated with the Apis bull. Thus, he may have been seen as overpowered with the previous plague. Another god of the Egyptians at this time, as well as Serapis, another god of medicine was Imhotep, also worshipped in Memphis. It is unclear how Imhotep was viewed by the Egyptians at this time, as well as Serapis for that matter, but the Egyptians must have been desperate, and if the Egyptians did call out to these or other gods for relief, they found none. Verse 11 indicates that Pharaoh summons the magicians/priests to help, or to show some sign of control, which obviously they had none. But once again, these men are left incapacitated and without any power. Egypt, its gods, and Pharaoh himself are under attack from a much more powerful God than they have ever imagined, and they are desperately losing. But Pharaoh's heart remains hard. Moses is once again instructed to go to Pharaoh, this time a warning unlike any other we have seen. And I am going to give you 4 different translations now from the English so that you can hear kind of how these different translations translate this warning. The NASB says, "For this time I will send all my plagues on you." This is Exodus 9:14, by the way. The NIV says, "Or this time I will send the full force of my plagues against you." The ESV says, "For this time I will send all my plagues on you yourself." And the JPS says, "For this time I will send all my plagues upon your person." The Hebrew translated "against you," "on yourself," and "upon your person" is the Hebrew el libecha, literally "to your heart." This is interesting. The English translators are noting this is an idiom, but Moses is certainly making a play with language, since Pharaoh's heart continues to be hard. Literally in the Hebrew says that his heart is heavy. This phrase may help us better understand God's assertion that he will send all his plagues on Pharaoh, or to his heart. The plagues to come would be more severe than the first 7 and would showcase the utter power of Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. These plagues would pierce the heart of Pharaoh and would make him yield to the true and living God. What is more, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh would use Pharaoh himself to show his power throughout the earth. As we go on, we'll see that I think that it's my suggestion that the way that these next plagues go against Pharaoh's heart is actually that they are hitting directly against direct relatives within the Egyptian pantheon. In other words, gods that are supposed to be relatives of Pharaoh. And of course, we know that ultimately the final plague is his own physical son, right? Who, once again, is going to be deified as the next Ra once Pharaoh is dead. Some of Pharaoh's own people now begin to heed the voice of Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh and do as instructed. This can only be salt in the wound of the Egyptian king. What is more, the fact that this was not a common act of nature can be seen by Moses' statement in verse 18 that this event would be greater than any hail that had ever been seen in Egyptian history. Snow and low freezing conditions are far and few between for this part of the world, even in January and February. And the reason I note January and February is because we can be fairly confident that this event took place during these months, since verse 31 tells us the flax and barley were budding. And January, February is the time in Egypt where the flax and the barley bud. Okay. Thus, the suggestion of hail during the daytime would have been difficult to believe if not directly from a supernatural presence. Another speculation we may now make is that the Egyptians believed their gods were not angry at them and bringing these judgments, but their pantheon was under attack from a much stronger and greater god. Nut was the goddess of the sky and was seen as the mother of the gods. Interestingly, her grandfather was none other than Ra, or Pharaoh. And so the assault on the king's mythical family is certainly underway. Granddaughter, right? The Nile was seen as the life giver, but Nut was responsible for taking the Nile to the heavens so that it could rain down on the earth below. Now the sky was raining down destruction in the form of ice and fire. What is more, this so-called mother was now the source of destruction as the hail struck plants, trees, and livestock, verse 25. Flax and barley are singled out in verse 31. This is significant as the Egyptian priests made their priestly garments out of flax. So now the Egyptians don't even have the right vestments to be able to oh man, it's so good. Just the humor that God continues to sprinkle through this is real. I mean, it really is a comical story. If you're seeing it from the eyes of Israel, right? The pantheon of Egypt is being toyed with by the Almighty God. It's perfect. This storm could have also been seen as an assault on the gods Set and Isis, children of Nut and great-grandchildren of Ra. Set was the god of chaos and storms. Isis, associated with the earlier goddess Hathor, became one of the most powerful deities in Egypt. Quote, Isis is an ancient Egyptian goddess associated with the earlier goddess Hathor, who became the most popular and enduring of all the Egyptian deities. Her name comes from the Egyptian Eset, meaning the seat, which referred to her stability and also the throne of Egypt, as she was considered the mother of every pharaoh through the king's association with Horus, Isis' son. Her name has also been interpreted as Queen of the Throne, and her original headdress was the empty throne of her murdered husband, Osiris. For those who remember our discussion on Exodus chapter 7, and this was back in part 1 of our series, and the Egyptian text, The Destruction of Mankind, you might remember that Hathor was the one who took it upon herself to kill those of mankind who had blasphemed Ra. Isis had responsibilities relating to the agriculture of Egypt, but now she seems helpless when faced with the God of Israel. The final attack of the true and living God is yet to come, but God's power is now front and center. There is no doubt that the gods of Egypt are no match for the God of Israel, but Pharaoh remains hardened. God has promised attacks against Pharaoh's heart, and they are about to come. And so I hope that this has been interesting for you and that you've learned something about Exodus chapter 9 and the plagues that are found therein. I would encourage any emails. You can send me an email, chag@TorahResource.com. That's chag@TorahResource.com. And any questions that you have, please send them there, and I will try to answer them on the next show. Also, don't forget to go back and watch the other ones if you haven't already. We'll be here next week at the same time. I'm presenting these live on Facebook, on the Torah Resource Facebook, and on Messiah Matters YouTube page every Thursday at 2 o'clock Pacific time. And so it should be 5 o'clock Eastern time. If you can't make it, you can always, if you can't make it live, you can always go back and watch them later. So I hope that you've enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me next week as we look at Exodus 10, 12, and ultimately the Exodus from Egypt.